The summer of 1314, a battlefield near Stirling would decide the fate of Scotland. On one side, 20,000 English soldiers, knights in shining armor, archers and footmen, confident in their sheer numbers. On the other, just 6,000 Scots, outnumbered, outarmed, and fighting for their very survival. What followed at Bannockburn was not just a clash of armies, but a turning point in history. Against all odds, the Scots would strike a blow so powerful it would echo for centuries. This is the story of how a small army humbled one of the mightiest forces in medieval Europe. The years leading up to Bannockburn were years of turmoil and uncertainty for Scotland. Ever since Edward the One of England had claimed overlordship of the Scottish crown, the land had been plunged into a brutal struggle for independence. The wars had dragged on for decades, leaving villages burned, fields ruined, and countless lives lost. By 1314, the fate of the nation balanced on a knife's edge. Edward II, determined to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, set his sights on crushing the last resistance in Scotland. His chosen target was Stirling Castle, a fortress that stood as the gateway to the north. If it fell into English hands, it would serve as a base to dominate the land, cutting off Scotland's heart. For Robert the Bruce, this was unthinkable. He knew that if Stirling was lost, so too would be the cause of freedom. The castle had been under siege by the Scots, but the defenders struck an agreement. If no relief arrived by midsummer, the garrison would surrender. This deadline gave Edward II no choice but to march his great host northward, gathering tens of thousands of men to break the Scottish blockade. It would be one of the largest armies England had ever sent across the border. Robert the Bruce was no stranger to the odds he faced. His kingdom was fragile, his resources limited, and his army was small compared to the force that England could field. Barely 6,000 men could be mustered under his banner. Farmers turned fighters, townsmen pressed into service, and a hardened core of seasoned warriors who had fought alongside him through years of guerrilla struggle. They carried simple weapons, long spears and shields, lacking the heavy armor and fine horses of the English knights. Yet Bruce understood something his enemy did not. Wars were not always won by numbers alone. He had learned from past defeats, from ambushes in the forests and raids across the countryside. He knew the land and he knew his men. Most importantly, he understood that they were not just fighting a battle. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their very right to exist as a free people. The road to Bannockburn was therefore more than a march. It was a march of destiny. Every Scot who followed Bruce to Stirling knew what was at stake. Victory meant hope, independence, and the survival of their kingdom. Defeat meant submission, ruin, and perhaps the end of Scotland itself. As news spread of Edward's massive army advancing northward, many in Europe believed the outcome was certain. How could a small, poorly equipped force stand against the might of 20,000 English soldiers, bolstered by cavalry, archers, and men-at-arms? Yet Robert the Bruce did not despair. Instead, he began preparing the ground, studying the terrain around Bannockburn, and setting the stage for a confrontation that would turn the course of history. What seemed to others an inevitable English triumph, Bruce saw as an opportunity, a chance to strike a blow so fierce that it would shatter England's hold and rally his people to the cause of freedom once and for all. At Bannockburn, the fate of nations rested on the shoulders of two very different rulers. Robert the Bruce and Edward II could not have been more unlike one another, and their contrasting qualities shaped every move of the battle. Robert the Bruce had risen from the turmoil of Scotland's wars, enduring years of exile, defeat, and constant struggle. He had learned the art of survival in the harshest way, building his authority not through sheer might but by inspiring men to fight beside him. Bruce did not stand apart from his soldiers. He fought among them, sharing the dangers of battle and the hardships of the march. His leadership was born of necessity, sharpened by years of guerrilla warfare where clever tactics mattered more than numbers. He understood how to use the land as an ally, how to strike where the enemy was weakest, and how to keep morale alive even when the odds were grim. His men saw in him not only their king, but also a comrade who carried the same risks and burdens they did. This trust would prove vital when the time came to face an enemy that outnumbered them more than 3-1. Edward II, on the other hand, carried the heavy legacy of his father, Edward the Fair, a king remembered as Hammer of the Scots. But where the father had been ruthless, cunning, and feared, The son was indecisive, mistrusted, and often at odds with his own nobles. By 1314, his rule in England was troubled. Many of his barons resented him, questioning his judgment and his ability to lead. Yet Edward could still summon a vast army, and he believed that sheer force of numbers would overwhelm the Scots. He marched north at the head of nearly 20,000 men, including knights in heavy armor, experienced archers, and infantry drawn from across his realm. On the surface, his host looked unstoppable, a display of power and wealth meant to remind Scotland of England's dominance. But behind that glittering show of strength lay divisions, arrogance, and poor coordination. The clash between these two leaders was more than personal. It was symbolic. Bruce embodied resilience, adaptation, and a cause greater than himself, the freedom of his people. Edward represented the might of empire, the belief that strength in numbers and wealth could subdue a smaller, rebellious neighbor. Where Bruce had sharpened his skill in years of hardship, Edward had little battlefield experience of his own and lacked the respect of many who followed him. These differences shaped the mood of their armies. The Scots, though fewer, were united and motivated. They knew their king trusted them, and they trusted him in return. The English, though many, lacked the same spirit. They were confident in their power, yet that confidence rested more on tradition and numbers than on faith in their leader. As the two armies drew closer to Stirling, the contrast became ever clearer. Bruce prepared carefully, choosing his ground with an eye for every hill, stream, and patch of soft soil that could hinder the enemy. Edward pressed forward, believing victory would be inevitable once his mass of soldiers came into contact with the smaller Scottish host. But Bannockburn was not to be decided by numbers alone. It would be decided by the kind of leadership each king could provide under the crushing weight of battle. In this, Bruce held the advantage long before the first sword was drawn. The first sparks of Bannockburn were struck on June 23, 1314, when the English vanguard clashed with the Scots. It was here that the battle's tone was set in a single, unforgettable moment. As the English knights advanced to test the Scottish lines, one among them, Henry de Bohun, a well-armed nobleman, saw an opportunity that he believed could end the war before it even began. Riding forward on his powerful warhorse, he spotted Robert the Bruce himself, mounted on a smaller steed, lightly armored, and seemingly exposed. To de Bohun, it was the chance of a lifetime. One quick strike could cut down the Scottish king and bring the rebellion crashing to an end. Lowering his lance, he charged, the thunder of hooves pounding across the field as both armies looked on. What followed was a scene that would become legend. Bruce, calm and composed, did not flee or hide behind his men. Instead, he held his ground, watching the knight bear down upon him. At the last moment, Bruce sidestepped his horse with remarkable control and swung his axe with all his strength. The blow split de Bohun's helmet and skull in a single stroke, felling him instantly. The Scots erupted into wild cheers, their confidence soaring. Their king had faced one of the mightiest knights in all of England and triumphed in front of both armies. For the English, however, the sight of their knight lying lifeless on the ground planted seeds of doubt. If Robert the Bruce could slay a charging knight with such ease, what else might these outnumbered rebels achieve? The skirmishes continued throughout that first day. English cavalry pressed forward again and again, expecting their sheer weight and momentum to scatter the Scottish formations. Yet Bruce's men stood firm in their schiltrons, tight circles bristling with long spears. These formations had been perfected by years of fighting against cavalry, turning the knight's greatest advantage into a weakness. Horses refused to charge headlong into walls of steel, and when they tried, both horse and rider were impaled or thrown into chaos. The Scots, though smaller in number, held their ground with a discipline and unity that astonished their enemy. Each repelled charge chipped away at the English sense of superiority, showing that courage and order could match armor and numbers. That evening, as the sun set, both armies prepared for what was to come. The English still believed their strength of numbers would tell in the end, but the first day had not gone as they expected. Instead of a broken enemy, they faced an army that had held firm, whose spirits had been lifted by the daring of their king. For the Scots, the first clashes were more than survival. They were proof that victory was possible. They had stood against the greatest knights in England, and had not only lived to tell the tale, but had bloodied their enemy in the process. The legend of de Bohun's fall spread through the Scottish camp that night like fire, binding the men closer together. What had begun as a desperate defense was slowly turning into a battle of belief. Robert the Bruce knew that raw courage alone would not be enough to stop the English host. His greatest weapon was not numbers or equipment, but the ground itself. When he chose Bannockburn as the place to meet Edward II's army, it was not by accident. The land around Stirling was narrow, broken by streams, marshes, and wooded patches. The Bannockburn, a twisting waterway, cut across part of the field, and the soil near it was soft and treacherous. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed a poor battlefield, but to Bruce it was perfect. It was ground that would choke the movements of cavalry, deny the English the full use of their numbers, and give his smaller force a chance to stand firm. He even ordered pits to be dug and camouflaged across the likely paths of the English horsemen, ready to break their charge and unseat riders before they could even reach the Scottish lines. The English, however, saw the terrain differently. With their confidence high and their army so vast, they believed no battlefield could deny them victory. They had brought with them one of the most feared military forces of the Middle Ages, heavy cavalry. These armored knights mounted on great war horses were accustomed to breaking infantry lines through sheer force. On open plains, few armies in Europe could withstand such an assault. Yet Bannockburn was no open plain. The narrow approaches and boggy ground left little room to maneuver. Horses struggled to find firm footing, and the tightly packed formations of English soldiers began to work against them rather than in their favor. What should have been an advantage was slowly turning into a trap. As the battle unfolded, the Scots used this to devastating effect. Their schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen, were positioned in places where cavalry could not easily outflank them. When English knights attempted to charge, they found themselves funneled into narrow spaces with marshy ground on either side. Instead of sweeping around the Scots, they crashed headlong into walls of spears. The great horses, unable to spread out or build up full speed, became bogged down and panicked. Riders were unseated, trampled, or struck down, and those behind could do nothing but push forward, adding to the chaos. Every foot of uneven ground seemed to fight for the Scots, turning the English army's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. The sheer size of Edward II's force only worsened the problem. With so many men crowded into such restricted space, the army became a mass of bodies, struggling for room to fight or even to breathe. Soldiers pressed against one another, unable to use their weapons effectively. Archers, who might have been decisive in open ground, could not be properly deployed because of the congestion and confusion. By contrast, Bruce's men moved with confidence. They knew the streams, the woods, and the marshes, and they used them to shield their flanks and guide the enemy into kill zones. It was as if the land itself had risen to join the Scots in their struggle for freedom. By choosing Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce had set the stage for a battle where numbers would count for little and discipline would count for everything. The English knights had hoped to ride down a scattered force of rebels, but instead they found themselves trapped in a killing ground of their own making. The battlefield, shaped and chosen with care, became the silent ally of the Scots, one that would play a decisive role in turning a hopeless defense into a historic victory. The morning of June 24, 1314, dawned with a sense of expectation on both sides. The English believed their sheer weight of numbers would finally break the Scots after all. 20,000 soldiers stood against only 6,000. To many in Edward II's camp, the first day's clashes had been nothing more than a prelude. Today they thought the rebellion would be crushed. But in the Scottish camp, spirits were rising. The men had watched their king slay Henry de Bohun with his own hands. They had held their ground against the cavalry, and they had seen that the English could bleed. Confidence spread, and with it the determination to fight not just for survival but for victory. Bruce seized the moment, calling his men forward, not to remain on the defensive but to take the fight directly to the enemy. The Scots advanced in their schiltrons, dense hedges of spears that bristled like iron walls. These formations, perfected in years of struggle, were designed to counter cavalry, and now they pressed forward across the narrow ground. The English knights, expecting the Scots to remain on the defensive, were stunned by the sight of their enemy advancing with such confidence. The knights charged again, but this time the Scots met them head-on. Horses and riders crashed against spears, many brought down before they could even reach the line. The tightness of the field only added to the destruction. When one charge failed, the men behind had no room to retreat, forcing them into the same fate. Edward tried to rely on his archers whose longbows had crushed enemies in past battles. But here the ground betrayed him once more. With little room to position them properly, his archers struggled to find clear shots. When they did, Scottish horsemen swept around the edges and scattered them before they could make an impact. Without their bowmen to weaken the Scottish ranks, the English were left to hurl wave after wave of cavalry into the solid spear walls. Each charge ended in failure, with knights trapped, unhorsed, or forced back into the press of their own men. As the morning wore on, the field became a nightmare for the English. The weight of their numbers began working against them. Soldiers and horses were packed so tightly that movement became impossible. Those at the front were crushed against the spears of the Scots, while those behind could not advance or retreat. Panic spread as men were trampled by their own side or drowned in the Bannockburn, the stream that cut across the battlefield. The chaos grew worse with every moment, and Edward's voice carried no authority in the storm. Orders were shouted but could not be obeyed, drowned out by the screams of men and animals. For the Scots, the sight was electrifying. What had seemed impossible was unfolding before their eyes. The mighty English host, thought invincible, was faltering. Bruce's men pushed forward with renewed vigor, their discipline unbroken, their spirit soaring. Each step drove the English further into disarray, and with every failed charge, the myth of their invincibility shattered. The second day at Bannockburn was no longer a test of endurance. It was the turning point, the moment when Scotland's outnumbered army began to transform a desperate stand into one of the greatest victories in its history. By the time the sun climbed higher on June 24th, the great English host was collapsing into disorder. What had begun as a proud display of power was dissolving into chaos and terror. Robert the Bruce, seeing the moment, ordered his schiltrons to press harder, and the Scots advanced like a living wall of iron. Each step forward drove the English back, squeezing them tighter into the narrow ground. Knights and infantry alike found themselves trapped between the spears ahead and the crush of their own comrades behind. The mighty cavalry, once the pride of England, was now useless, bogged down, exhausted, and surrounded by panic. Horses screamed, men fell, and the Bannockburn stream became a grave for many who tried to flee across its waters. Edward II himself, who had marched north expecting a swift and decisive victory, now realized he was on the brink of disaster. His men were dying in thousands, and nothing he commanded could restore order. Panic spread even to the highest ranks. Nobles who had come to Bannockburn with banners flying and confidence blazing now fought desperately to save their own lives. The pressure of bodies made it nearly impossible to maneuver. Those who stumbled were trampled, while others were pushed into the mud and suffocated beneath the weight of men and horses. The battlefield, once thought to be the stage of an English triumph, was transformed into a trap from which escape seemed impossible. The Scots, though fewer, fought with relentless energy. Every man knew what was at stake, and with each English retreat their courage grew. The ground itself seemed to fight for them, hemming the enemy in and turning confusion into slaughter. Archers who might have offered relief to the English were gone, scattered by swift Scottish riders. Cavalry, once their greatest weapon, had become a burden. Infantry, caught in the press, could not form proper ranks. The English army was no longer fighting a battle. It was fighting to survive. When Edward realized the battle was lost, he abandoned the field, narrowly escaping capture. Protected by his household guard, he fled toward Dunbar and then to England, leaving his vast army to its fate. Leaderless and broken, the English host dissolved. What followed was not an organized retreat but a rout. Thousands fled in panic, many cut down by the pursuing Scots, others drowning as they tried to cross the Burn or the nearby Forth River. The pride of England lay shattered, its greatest force humiliated by an army a fraction of its size. For Scotland, the sight was unforgettable. Against all odds, the outnumbered had triumphed. Bannockburn was no ordinary victory. It was a statement to the world that Scotland would not be conquered by sheer numbers or power. The rout of the English showed that determination, unity, and skill could overcome even the most formidable foe. It was a day that turned despair into hope, rebellion into triumph, and a fragile kingdom into a nation reborn. The Battle of Bannockburn was more than a clash of swords and spears. It was a defining moment in the history of Scotland. For 2 long days in June 1314, a smaller, poorly equipped Scottish army faced down a force more than 3 times its size. On paper, the English should have crushed them easily. Yet the outcome proved that wars are not won by numbers alone, but by leadership, preparation, and the will of men fighting for a cause greater than themselves. Robert the Bruce understood his people, his land, and his enemy in a way Edward II never could. Where the English relied on pride and sheer power, the Scots relied on discipline, strategy, and the determination to be free. When the English host broke apart, fleeing in panic and leaving thousands of dead behind, it was not just a battlefield defeat. It was a humiliation that shattered England's confidence and changed the balance of power in Britain. For Scotland, Bannockburn was more than a victory. It was vindication. It showed that a nation long dismissed as weaker and destined for conquest could rise up and stand against one of the strongest military powers in Europe. It breathed new life into the fight for independence and gave the Scots a story of triumph that would be told for centuries. The image of Robert the Bruce striking down Henry de Bohun, the disciplined Chiltern standing firm against wave after wave of cavalry, and the panic of the English trapped in the marshes became part of Scotland's national memory. Generations would look back on Bannockburn not only as a turning point in a war, but as a symbol of unity and resilience. The battle did not end the struggle. Wars and negotiations would continue for years, but it gave the Scots a decisive edge, proving that their freedom was not just a dream, but a real and achievable future. Today, Bannockburn stands as a reminder of how courage and clever leadership can overturn the mightiest of odds. It is remembered not as the story of 20,000 English soldiers defeated, but as the story of 6,000 Scots who refused to surrender. Against armor, numbers, and power, they brought belief, discipline, and the will to endure. In the end, that was enough to carve their place in history. The fields near Stirling still echo with their triumph, a victory that ensured Scotland's fight for independence would never be forgotten.